Okay, hello everybody out there in the internet and here. Do you have the roll done?
I do.
Okay,
I've noted who's present. Who is iPhone there? Francis, is that you that's just listed as iPhone?
I think it is. I'm in a kind of a public place, so I won't turn on my video.
That's okay. That is you, Francis. I'll note
me.
your attendance. Thank you.
Okay, do we have a motion to approve the June minutes? Is there a second? I think so.
Second it.
Great. All in favor? Anyone opposed? All right. And is there a motion to approve the July minutes? Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks, Ben. All in favor? All right, great. I am very excited to introduce our new member, everyone. This is Shelley. If you want to share a little bit about your background and what you're into, I would love that.
Hi, I'm Shelley Tysus. I've been a citizen of Clayton for I've owned my home for 13 years, but I moved into the area about, I want to say 2004. I lived over in the Morelands area originally in an apartment, moved to Richmond Heights for a short time. When I got married, we moved and bought a house in Clayton. So I've been around for 20, I don't know one day. It's been a while, probably since 2004. So about 20 years. I have my own business. I've owned my own business for about 13 years. We're registered here in Clayton and we work nationwide. We provide sign language interpreting services and captioning services, again, nationwide. So I've been, and I have pretty depth background of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, equity, and then I'm kind of a service nerd. So I really appreciate and enjoy giving service to my community. I'm also married. Air Force wife, and also extremely busy family. I also have a 5-year-old boy, another COVID baby, and a 10-year-old little girl.
It's nice to meet you.
I'm sorry, I introduced myself.
Very impressive resume, that's for sure.
We will.
I think Ted is like an attendee and wants to be a panelist, I suspect. Do you see that? Thanks.
Would it be helpful for you to have everyone just very, very quickly introduce ourselves?
Sure, you can. I just, not to be weird, I did read about you on the internet, so you're totally fine.
Stuart, do you want to go first?
Thank you.
Very briefly, like one sentence. You want to introduce yourself?
Myself?
Yeah, go for it. Here.
Stuart Berkowitz, Shelley. I've been on the commission since it was created. I think Ben and I are the last legacy people who started it.
Joanna gets credit for, yeah.
Oh, that's right. Francis also.
Francis.
So, in real life, I'm an attorney. I hope that doesn't disqualify me. My focus really has been on administration of justice here in Clayton, mainly the police practices with Chief Smith and also the municipal court. So regularly meet with them and I always have issues with them. So that's basically what I've been doing.
Great. Ben, do you want to go next?
Oh,
Quickly, I'll second what our distinguished person said. And I worked a number of years hard to get this Community Equity Commission created. And it is not created. It's done some very, very good things. And we look forward to having you with us. I was the mayor of Clayton for some 10 years. But more importantly, I'm on this commission right now. Thank you very much.
Ben, let's see who's next on the screen. Joanna.
Hello, welcome. I am Joanna Schooler and I am with Washington University in the Office of Government and Community Relations. I serve as an ex officio member representing higher education, and I've been on the commission since the start and appreciate the ability to to be able to collaborate with this wonderful group of people. Thank you.
Ted?
Hi, I'm Ted Wheeler, small business owner in Clayton, and have lived here, I think, for 20 some odd years. And again, I would echo the two previous folks and say it is an honor to be on the commission. I really enjoy it, and want to extend my warmest welcomes to you.
Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Schutte. I am an attorney for the government. I've been living in Clayton for almost 10 years, and I've been serving on the commission for 2 or 3 years now. I'm in Ward 1, closest to the city, and I was having quite a bit of difficulty hearing initially, so I'm going to have to check in later to see what I missed. And I will have to also leave early today, so I'm sorry for being here just for a brief minute, but I wanted to say welcome and really looking forward to working with you.
Francis? If you're able to. I know you said you're in a public place.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I'll be quick. I'm actually in Portland at the moment. So welcome, Shelley. I've been, I guess, with Stuart and Ben, one of the original commissioners. Been on it for a long time, I think, through COVID, through George Floyd. So there's a lot done at that time. There's still a lot to do. It's been a pleasure serving on this commission. I think you'll find it very productive. And welcome. Thank you.
Becky?
Yeah, hi, I'm Becky Patel. I'm actually the alderman whose nameplate is at the seat Lauren is in. Just coincidentally, Gary sat at his seat. I am in my 16th year of residency in Clayton and 5th year of board service. So.
I'm Gary Fader. I'm having coffee with Shelley on Monday, so I don't want to give too much away, but I've been here since 1966 when I was brought here as an infant. It's a little joke. Actually, I started at Washington U in 1966, but I am also an attorney, and I was claim to fame was that I was Ben's law partner, Ben Ushito's law partner. And I've been on this commission since I started as an alderman.
I am Lauren. I am your chair. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I am in my 2nd term on this commission. So yeah, I'm really happy to have you. Thanks for being here.
May I add one more thing?
Yeah.
I forgot to mention also, previous to this commission, I actually worked on I volunteered on the sign language interpreter board of interpreters as well. I was there since 2014. After the pandemic, they determined that we no longer needed the board. I'm basically the only member left, but it will disband. So I do have about 10 years experience or 11 years experience being on another board. So if you start to see me do sign language, like seconding things, it's because I'm used to doing it in sign language. So anyway.
Very cool. Great. Thank you, everyone. I think next on the agenda, I can't see it on the screen right now, but I think is Chief Smith here. Thank you so much for being here.
All right.
What we've got going on.
Well, good evening. Thanks for having me. I want to say welcome to Shelley as well. As some of you heard, I've known her for a long time. She comes to a lot of our community events, been coming to our Coffee with the Cops for like 10 years, I believe, and always gives us good advice and actually helps me with some traffic enforcement over in the center parking lot when she notices some of the kids are speeding through there. So we appreciate her input. So I was asked today to come and talk about hate crimes. And so I wanted to start off, and David, I got control of it now, don't I? So, yes, okay. First, I wanted to address what's the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident. These things, this confusion comes up sometimes. And this is straight from the state statute from Missouri. A hate crime is a crime that the state believes to be knowingly motivated because of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, or disability of the victim or victims. A hate incident is motivated by bias or hate, but does not rise to a criminal offense. So an example of a hate crime would be graffiti with racial slurs. That's a hate crime. A hate incident would be offensive comments protected by the First Amendment. Sometimes you'll see those at demonstrations. I was looking for a picture. We actually had a demonstration with white supremacists here in 2011, and I remember what they were demonstrating about. But it was very convoluted reason why they came to Clayton, but they were on the steps of the St. Louis County Police Department, and we actually had to provide them protection because people were jeering them. And why are you letting them spew this hate? Well, it was constitutionally protected free speech. It wasn't necessarily a hate crime. So those are examples of each. Missouri hate crime statutes, they enhance penalties when crimes are motivated by bias. So, and these typically apply to assaults, property damages, harassment, threats. So in sentencing, it can elevate a crime from a misdemeanor to a felony or a higher class felony, and so which allows for harsher penalties. So if we had a property damage that was motivated by hate, and it was a felony amount of property damage, it would go from a class E felony, which would be a maximum of 4 years. A normal property damage felony would be a 4-year maximum sentence, to a class D, it's enhanced to a class D felony if it's a hate crime, which would increase the sentencing to 7 years. And so, we do have a policy on hate crimes it gives our officers guidance. We updated this in 2019. It establishes guidelines for collecting evidence and conducting investigations, also protocols for communicating with the victim, the targeted community group, and the public. So a lot of times if a hate crime sometimes is directed at one specific victim, but the whole community in that group feels that crime, right? So we want to reach out to that community and help communicate what we're doing to protect them. And so that's established in this policy. We also submit data to the on hate crimes to the FBI on a monthly basis. Our reports management system automatically does that. Once the report's approved, the data goes to the FBI, and they collect data on all crimes, all the serious crimes, including hate crimes. Also wanted to address the release of hateful images, hate crime images, because this came up in our recent incident in August. There's 2 reasons why we typically don't release those images. The graffiti may reveal the victim's location, could be a victim's home, and unintentionally identify the victim. So we want to protect the victim's privacy there. But we also might want to honor their wishes if they're directly targeted in that graffiti. If there's statements about them in there, they may not want those offensive words publicized. The other thing is we don't want to amplify the hate. We don't want to do the dirty work of the bad guy by putting their message out there. And the reason I'm bringing this up, we received some criticism. One of our residents, I had a respectful conversation with him. He thought that with the August incident, there was graffiti with hateful graffiti on the spray painted on the street. What's interesting about it, our officers were processing the crime scene, and a local news channel put a drone up in the middle of that, and they were able to capture that image. And they didn't put everything on there. We told them, hey, if you put that on there, you're going to identify the victim. That would be bad. And they agreed to do that. But I heard from a member of the community who thought, hey, we should tell people the type of hate out there. We should let the world know that this kind of hate's out there and we're being targeted. And I explained to him the reasons why we don't. And he had an understanding. And he also received criticism from somebody in the press for not putting it out there as well. But that's the reason we typically don't release those images. So hate crimes in Clayton, we went back and looked at 20 years of data. We could only find 3 incidents that were, specific to hate crimes. In 2013, we had an anti-Semitic graffiti painted on a car. In that incident, there were some possible suspects identified. We could never prosecute them, not enough to prosecute them. The victim may have had a prior relationship with the perpetrator in that one. In May 12th of 2025, so we had 2 in this past year, and you're aware of them. We had racist and anti-Semitic graffiti at Glenridge School. 2 juveniles were arrested in that case. And as you know, with juvenile law, there's privacy built into the juvenile system, so we can't identify the juveniles. Also, we don't know the type of accountability they receive, what type of punishment they receive. So that's all private, and they won't even tell me that. the juvenile system really is meant to, repair what they did and get them on the right track and then seal their records after they become adults. And then August 5th of 2025, we had 3 cars set on fire and an anti-Semitic graffiti left at the home of a Jewish resident. That case is still being investigated. That's an image of one of the cars right there that was burnt. Just a little bit of history. There was, I'm on the board of directors for the Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis. We are celebrating our 60th anniversary this year. One of my responsibilities for the 60th anniversary celebration is to create a book of the history. One of the cases we are featuring occurred in Richmond Heights in 1977. There was a sniper who opened fire at a synagogue at 1107 Linden. That synagogue's no longer there. For reference, that would be a block south of the Tropicana. Just go a block past south of Tropicana, I believe. There's condominiums there now. Sniper shot to death Gerald Gordon as he left the bar mitzvah and at the synagogue. In 1994, Joseph Paul Franklin confessed to the murder while serving time in federal prison. Franklin was an avowed white supremacist who planned to kill as many Jews as possible. He was serving quite a lengthy record. Franklin killed 2 black men in Utah, killed an interracial couple in Wisconsin, bombed a synagogue in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and shot Larry Flint and Vernon Jordan of the National Urban League. So this is a prolific criminal who was motivated by hate, and he actually confessed while he was in prison because he said he wanted to cleanse his conscience. So they were able to close that case. But just something that was infamous in 1977. I was born in 1977, so I just became familiar with the history while researching the Major Case Squad history here. As far as trends in the United States, these are stats I've taken from the FBI over the last 5 years. You can see that we had 55% of hate crimes over the last 5 years involved race, ethnicity, or ancestry. And over on the right side of that circle graph, you can see the other categories. Gender makes up 1%. Religion makes up 20% of hate crimes. Disability, 1.6%. Gender identity, 4.1%. And sexual orientation, 17%. And then when you break that down into groups, anti-Black hate crime is the most common at 28% over the last 5 years. Anti-Jewish is the second at 13%. Anti-gay, 9%. Anti-white, 8%. Anti-Hispanic, 7%. And then they have a mixed group here of anti-lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And I didn't do so much research, and I'm guessing those are targeted at organizations, establishments that cater to the LGBT community as a whole. And then in Missouri over the last 5 years, the stats are not too much. They don't deviate too much from the national stats. As you can see here, race and ethnicity make up 57% for Missouri as well. And then 2.6 for gender, religion 16%, disability 2.5, gender identity 4.3, and sexual orientation 15.7. If you look at anti-Black hate crime, in the United States, it was 28% of hate crimes were anti-Black over the last 5 years. In Missouri, it's 29%, so it's very close. But in the over the United States, the second highest group is anti-Jewish hate crime at 13%. But in Missouri, it goes down to anti-white at 13%, anti-gay at 7%, anti-LGBT at 6%. And then if you see anti-Jewish makes up 4% in Missouri, whereas it's a bigger problem in the national scene at 13% of the national stats. 2024 hate crime stats from the FBI. These actually just came out coincidentally on August 5th. They prepared the report the same day we had our incident here in Clayton. In 2024, we had 11,679 hate crimes. That's slightly less than the year before. So a 1.5% decrease, but still the second highest on record. 2024 was the highest on record for hate crimes. They've been collecting this data since 2021. And as you can see, if you look at the over the 34 years, the stats go up. And I would imagine that's because of awareness. People know that, hey, we want you to report those kind of things. So the numbers have gone up over the years. Anti-Jewish hate crime actually increased by 5.8%, even though the trend went down slightly at 1.5. Anti-Jewish hate crime went up in 2024 by 5.8%. with over 1,900 incidents, 179 of them being assaults. 16% or 16% of all reported hate crime, and 70% of all religious-based hate crimes. You saw over the 5-year trend, it was 13%, but last year it ended up being 16%. So there is an increase there. And that's my presentation there. So does anybody have any questions about hate crimes?
I have
If-
one.
Do you, are you ever asked by the school district to do any type of presentation on this subject?
I have not been asked by the school district on that, no.
Yeah, I'm just curious because I think the school districts indicated in the last few months that they're trying to sort of
Yeah,
be more aggressive about speaking out against hate crime.
sure. And we are in constant communication, you know, as we know, we have the 3 school resource officers there. And so we do talk a lot about crime and safety, but they haven't asked me to talk about this specific topic.
Yeah. And I don't know for a fact that if you, obviously it's a captive audience, but if you had a group of seniors and you presented it, I don't know whether that's meaningful or
Mhm.
not. I find this information meaningful. I just wonder whether they would.
Yeah.
I have a question. At the beginning, it sounded like you were, explaining a difference between protected speech that might be offensive and hateful
Right.
and criminal harassment or threats.
Mhm.
Like that there are, which would still be speech, but like would rise to being a criminal offense. Is that right? Can
Sure.
you, what can you say about how the law distinguishes between speech that is just like offensive but protected versus
So
when
direct
it
threat.
becomes,
Direct threats. If you're saying you're going to hurt somebody and you can actually carry that out,
yeah.
that would be considered harassment or even assault, low-level assault if you physically threaten somebody.
The ordinance actually mentions intimidate. For you to burn a cross, but if you burn a cross in somebody's front yard, to intimidate.
Chief, could you repeat that just so the
Oh, yeah.
people
What,
online can hear?
Al, you want to
Or-
explain?
Got the two.
So in the, I teach a class on this in,
Wonderful.
through field force operations. And one of the big differences is the intimidation factor of the speech or the act. So one of the things we teach in the class is it's legal to burn a cross, but it's not legal to burn a cross if you're doing it to intimidate a person. If you take the cross and you burn it in someone's front yard, that becomes a crime right there because you're doing it as a form of intimidation. But if you do it in your own yard, there's nothing we can do about that.
Is it like, is it important that it's directed at like a very specific person or organization versus like a general class of people? Is that?
Yeah, I would say so.
I would say, you know, a lot of the complaints we received about this was there were demonstrations against Israel in late 2023. And there were some things that the Jewish community found offensive. And it was directed at the country of Israel, but they weren't threats against any Americans. Nothing could be carried out, right?
Okay,
And so that would be, yeah, so that wouldn't be considered a crime.
okay, thank you.
And just to reiterate what Captain Thuet said, so he does teach that First Amendment education to field force operations. That's actually protest activity. And so our officers receive all that type of training. We understand what can be said, what can't be said, because that comes into play, especially with anti-police protests that we've seen a lot over the last 10 years. And he's actually one of our regional experts. I don't mind gloating about him in this field here in St. Louis. So.
Yeah, Mark, let me follow up on one thing you said. I think there's a state statute, I may be wrong, dealing with cross burning on somebody's lawn. I think there's a state statute on that.
Actually, the federal.
Okay, because we do have a state statute, I think, because I think it was involved in getting that passed. But with regard to, you know, anti-Israel protests, you didn't put anything on your reporting regarding the protests at WashU where some people were charged. I know that WashU is in 3 different places.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, they were charged with, were there hate crime charges there, or were they charged with trespassing during a protest?
I think there were 5 or 6 people charged. The worst was, you know, Stein was charged with assault. Nobody was charged with a hate crime, but it had to do with I think WashU had asked them to leave
Right, yeah.
and
so
they
it'd be a
refused to
trespass.
leave.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was just focused
Yeah.
on hate crimes. And so that's a whole nother
But
discussion
the Jewish
about,
students, felt
Yeah.
that these were, a lot of it was anti-Semitic, so that was
Sure.
going on at WashU campus. So I don't
Sure.
know, but you're not including that, so.
It probably wasn't in the
It was
jurisdiction.
right. Say the campus, the area where the protests were taking place, where it was in unincorporated St. Louis County.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, Shelley Tice here. So I was actually just, pondering, what Gary was saying about, having this at some point available to, and I don't know exactly what curriculum would look like or if it's possible. I just know having a 5-year-old and 10-year-old, like really, and also the people that were just charged were juveniles, right? Like we were talking about these juveniles who did this crime,
Yeah.
and we're still investigating the other one. They're so impressionable when they're younger. And I just wonder if there's just a way to start it early. I will tell you, I have a 5-year-old, Mark Mitchell, from the pandemic. And I will tell you everyone's like, the poor kid. I'm like, I'm actually excited about this kid. He saw no one's faces. He saw no one's bodies. All he knew were people's eyes. He knew that he liked people because of how they made him feel. He did not see gender or race or anything for like 3 years. Like the guy, because he has health conditions, so he was very isolated. So I'm actually really excited about that, right? Because then that's a whole other generation that's going to come out potentially different. However, you get them into schools and they get really easily influenced. And I can tell really at the 10-year-old, like even like the last couple of years, there's been necessarily bullying, but definitely people kind of more status, like things are kind of happening at school. And I just wonder if that's the time, because even some of the stuff they're already teaching in elementary, various different races are in my daughter's friendship. They stay at our home. Like there's no barrier there, right? But at some point that comes in. And I think if we can teach them earlier about that, maybe they would stand up for their peers in middle school. I think high school might even be too late. So again, I don't know if there's a way to, look at curriculum. I know that Dr. Murdoch, I think like other people would be open to that, but I just don't know what that would look like. But it would be really great. I just don't know how the community, how do we also how curriculums are made, parents and like getting all of that approved in a positive way, not like these people died and cars are blown up. My kids don't even know that those things happen. So
and I believe the school district is looking at having a speaker series
Good.
to cover multiple, groups of people talking about that. I have concerns too. If you watch social media, how they destigmatize a lot of racial slurs on social media. And so, and if kids see that, they could, accept that and start using it. And so it's something we want to, educate them on the seriousness of those kind of things. So.
yeah, especially since it did just happen at the elementary school. It's like that happened, and both my kids broke their feet. I was like, so like, then there's a tornado. It's like all this emotion that one week, and my kids I don't think my kids even knew that happened at school because I was like, I don't want them to be fearful. But if it's happening at the elementary school, yeah, I feel like, yeah. Anyway, just.
Anything else from anybody else on this matter? Great, thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Yep.
Chief.
All right, so again, a discussion on what we want to prioritize for the upcoming year. I know Stuart is raring to go with his idea, so I'll give it over to you for the first idea or what you've been working on.
Well, actually, I have another idea before I get to the idea you know about. So, because that's more of a thing that I think we can discuss secondly. But the other idea has to do, it's kind of rises out of discussions I've had with Gary and with Steve Strom over the past couple of weeks. And has to do with discussion the board is having, and Becky, you know more about this also, the changes in the charter, which I understand may be on the ballot in November. And a vast majority of the changes, as I've been told, because I haven't looked at it, but this is coming from Gary, that they're really technical, just to bring the charter into the 21st century. Just minor language changes, but there's one substantive change that they're discussing, and that has to do with the selection of the municipal judge. And what they're discussing is eliminating the 2-year requirement, which is something that we discussed in the spring when, you know, the judgeship was up for renewal after only 2 years. And we ran into the charter. And then, pardon me, the second thing is the residency in Clayton of the judge. And it's my understanding that the board is considering eliminating those 2 requirements with regard to the changes proposed, that will be proposed for the charter changes in November, okay? Now, the driving reason for those changes would be to make Clayton consistent with some of the surrounding municipalities and discuss the idea of having a regional court system that would include more than Clayton. And so I know that other areas have done that also, particularly St. Anne. So if that's something that's on the agenda for Clayton, then certainly I think the Equity Commission should have a seat at the table because, you know, getting involved in something like that obviously involves totally changing, our court system that we've had here forever. So that's what I wanted to put before everybody. By the way, I would heartily endorse those changes in the charter. I think they make a lot of sense.
I just want to clarify a little bit, if I could, and David will correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know that I'm necessarily disagreeing with anything you said, Stuart, but a major thing that we're proposing through the charter amendment is to take out a whole bunch of stuff in the charter that is really prescriptive about like how to organize and like manage city government and allow it to be managed by ordinance through the board or future city council, as we're proposing we be renamed. And so so the idea of that, what I would say is that I believe our intent is not to make any like major structural changes initially, and that any that would happen then by ordinance, and it would allow us as elected officials to be more responsive to new opportunities or best practices or things that come up in order to, right? So like what we did with the, this commission put a lot of work into making a recommendation to the board to improve the kind of transparency and equity lens applied to the municipal judge selection process. And the board accepted that and put that in ordinance to codify it as a practice. And so you'd see us be able to do those kinds of things across a wider range of services and responsibilities that we have to the community. So.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Becky said. So it is my understanding the charter, which was adopted in the 1950s, in many ways sort of set a blueprint for the city and said, hey, when you organize all these departments, here's kind of what they ought to look like. And we know you're going to do that eventually by ordinances. Well, we did all those things by ordinances in the last 75 years. And so a lot of the stuff that Becky's referring to is basically duplicative. And but most importantly, where the charter and ordinances are inconsistent, the charter always prevails. That's just sort of because it's a little bit like our Constitution. So to the extent the charter says that the municipal judge has to be a resident, which it does, we can't change that by ordinance. And so that's one of the reasons that we're trying to take that out of the charter, because otherwise we can't fix that. But I think the board generally agrees we want to have the opportunity, and David would take the lead on continuing to talk to other communities about can we bring our municipal court system together in a way that we not only maybe be more efficient, but also be more economical, because all of these various cities don't need to spend all the money having their own courts. And the only way to make that work as a practical matter is we have to have that future hypothetical judge be able to be from anywhere within Well, however many, so that's the purpose of doing that. Anyway,
Yeah,
David.
and I'll just say really quickly for anybody that's not familiar with that entire system, Clayton is a home rule charter city, which means we basically get to set the rules for ourselves. So unless the state of Missouri says we can't do something, we can if our voters put that in place. So the charter that's formed is as Alderman Vader said, essentially the city's constitution. In order to amend that charter, you have to go to the voters and a majority of the voters have to approve any changes to the charter. So we have a number of things throughout the charter that areas where you would want to be flexible that deal with operations, minor structural things that we can't touch without going and getting voter approval. So the idea again is to take those things out of the charter and then codify them within the code of ordinances, which is a legislative action. So the Board of Aldermen or City Council, as we're proposing to change the name, can make those adjustments as things progress. So in the area of municipal courts, there is a conversation within the mid-county area just about consolidating various functions generally. And so one of the things that's part of that conversation is municipal courts. I was talking to a city manager the other day, and they do something like 60 tickets a month or something, but they're operating a municipal court, which just is really inefficient. It would make much more sense for them to consolidate that function with other communities. So we're seeing if it's possible to put some sort of structure in place to accommodate a larger court. And so in order to do that, though, we would have this hindrance in the charter that says the judge has to be a resident. We've all these specific rules for who the judge has to be. Well, if a court system ended up being more efficient, some kind of consolidated court, and we wanted to join, those charter constraints wouldn't allow us to do that unless the judge for that overall consolidated court met all of the specifications that are within our charter. So in order to have flexibility going forward, it makes a lot of sense to put it in the code of ordinances. And so that's one of the changes that's proposed. All that being said, what we need to do between now and when the voters go to the polls in November to decide on the charter is work on these various ordinances so that if the charter changes or amendment, the charter amendment is approved, then we can go ahead and codify all of these things. So in the area of municipal court, I agree. I think it's something we can have the Equity Commission take a look at and just see how we prescribe that all of the court functions going forward, what the judge requirements would be, because all of that would have to be approved by the Board of Aldermen or future city council. So
Question, would this also impact on the selection or operation of the prosecuting attorney?
it would not. The prosecutor is not contained within the charter. The prosecutor is in the code of ordinances. And essentially all the prosecutor or the only reference to the prosecuting attorney within the ordinances just says that the prosecutor is appointed by the city manager and ratified by the Board of Aldermen. So this wouldn't impact the prosecutor at all.
Thank you.
All right. So that sounds like something that Stuart, you would be interested in being in contact with David.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely, sure.
great. Anything else from you on your end?
If you want me to go ahead, I'll keep going.
If you have another idea you'd like to throw out there for the year,
The other
now would be the
idea-
time.
as Ben just mentioned, has to deal with prosecuting attorney. I've talked to Gary and virtually everybody else except Shelley.
You haven't talked to me, so just,
I'm sorry.
yeah, it doesn't.
Not, was not
yeah.
intentional.
You can speak for yourself
Yeah.
and let other people speak for themselves.
But I also just talked to Dave, and Dave already has a selection process for the prosecuting attorney, and I'm only suggesting that he sort of expand it a little bit to include a member of the Equity Commission and maybe somebody who represents the interests of defendants, like someone from Arch Defenders, in that selection process. And that's what I'm just proposing here. More
Oversimplify, what is Dave's procedure?
Right now, as I understand it, you can.
Well, David can,
Yeah, and so we discussed it with the Equity Commission as well when we talked about the municipal judge process years ago. And so what we do is at the same time, and right now it's a 2-year interval, when the municipal judge position is posted, we also post the prosecuting attorney position. The process is a little bit different where, again, the charter prescribes that the Board of Aldermen make the appointment for the municipal judge. For the prosecutor, it's a city manager appointment, and then the Board of Aldermen ratifies it. The process for prosecutor, when we have applicants, and this last time, the only applicant was the current prosecutor, is I put a committee together. It's myself, it's Chief Smith, it's our Director of Planning, Anna Crane, and then I have an attorney from the community sit on that as well. So last time around, a member of the community that's an attorney sat in that seat. She's also on our Board of Adjustment. So that was our citizen input. And you know, I personally, when we're in those meetings, give a lot of weight to the chief of police and to our director of planning, because the prosecutor functions a little bit different than the municipal judge, where the judge in the end has the discretion to make these particular rulings on the prosecutor side of things. And I understand why you would want that equity perspective and what the prosecutor is doing. The prosecutor is taking the violations that our city staff sees out in the field. You know, they write the violation. There's some sort of citation, and then they hand that to the prosecutor to take to the court. So I want to make sure that that prosecutor is meeting the needs of our police department and our planning department, who I have full confidence and faith in, that when they're writing a citation, that they're doing so because they've seen a valid violation of our ordinances or of the law. So I'm totally open to having somebody from the Equity Commission sit on that particular panel. I think it's good to have an attorney on there like we're currently doing. But I do want to just explain the nuances a little bit because it is different when you're selecting a prosecutor versus a judge, because the prosecutor really is a part of your administration. It's, you know, essentially an arm of your staff almost that's taking those violations and bringing them to the court and then representing in the end our law enforcement officers and our code enforcement officers. So
I think, David, you're welcoming a member of the of our Community Equity Commission to help you out, or is a good one.
So for that to happen, would that be something you would need
no, I mean, if you'd like to make a motion to that effect, then we can do that. If you'd like to make that recommendation.
I make
And
a
then
motion that
next time we
include
open it up
someone
in
from the
a
Equity
year and a
Commission.
half, then.
Yeah, it's been a while. Okay, you're moving that?
Sure.
There's
Make a
that.
motion that Dave, you include a member of the Equity Commission on their selection committee.
Second,
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay. Well done, Stuart.
Thank you.
Okay. So another thing that's been kicked around by myself for the last 3 meetings is our ability as an equity commission to have a list of apolitical resources regarding immigration on the website. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, there hasn't been much pushback to that as long as it's not anything contentious and it's literally just like, here's attorneys that exist in Clayton that
I
work
don't
on.
know that it'll necessarily be it's hard to direct people to counsel. But there are resources out there that I think we could
put.
we could probably post. We just need to be in this current climate somewhat
Sure.
sensitive to what we put out there and how
Making
that's
it
all packaged. But
as
we
like,
do have, you know, on our website, we have an entire area that's dedicated towards residents, various resources. So, you know, it's all this, hey, I'm a new resident in Clayton. Here's all these different things that are available. So I think we could find some widely published, especially government leaning organizations out there that assist with those that are immigrating, not just to the country, but to Clayton,
perfect.
things they could reach out to.
Great. So I'm happy to work on putting that list together. If there's anyone out there who wants to be a part of that, wants to help. I know Frances had mentioned before she was interested, but I think she had to leave. Anyone in the internet interested in helping me with that? Great, I will do it then. Okay, cool.
I will help you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I will email you about it. Cool. Okay. Other ideas or thoughts? I know you might, Shelley might have some really great ideas for us.
Great ideas. I don't know, but again, I mentioned I've lived here for a long time, so we use the city all the time. So really, when I think of equity, I think of how we're using the city and how it could appeal to everyone. I'm what I consider an older parent. So, you know, we have, so what I would like to see is just a little bit more accessibility throughout the city. Potentially, obviously, with people, not if it's obvious, with people with disabilities, we really don't have a lot of accessibility at any of our events. And then also I'd like to see a little bit more around families as well, because most of my friends are older parents and they've got younger kids. I know you have a 5-year-old. And we will sometimes just take off from our house and walk through the city. Sometimes we'll stop at the fountain and then we'll walk to Shaw Park and then we'll walk over even to Shake Shack. Like we literally use the city. If there's any construction, I have a young son also who we have to stop and watch trucks for a very long time through all the buildings. With that said, there's really not any restaurants for us to go to. Like the way the city is designed, it really is designed for, I feel like a lot of this new stuff that's coming in, the golf place that we went to, 5 Iron, you know, is it Flight Club? All those things are wonderful as well, but there really aren't really a lot of family activities. And I'm not talking like a play area, but, you know, more accessible restaurants. One of the issues that we've had in our communities, we are right on what's called Northmore Park Edition, I think is where we are. So we're right on the U City and Clayton line. And since we've lived there, the path to get to White Elm Forest has been cut off. And so now my daughter can no longer walk to her friend's house. Her friends can no longer walk to us. We basically have to walk all the way around now the community. So I would like to, you know, consider maybe re-adding paths, or, you know, I talked to my neighbor who's lived there. He grew up in the house and then bought the house, and he's now in his 70s. So he knows everything that's happened in the city. Periodically over time, people have just built over paths. And then now we're sort of cut off from the community. So I really would like to at some point talk about, you know, being accessible more to families, neighborhoods and paths, dinings. Basically, we have to go to the toy store. That's basically like we have to go to Toy Store 5-star. We're getting kind of bored of the same restaurants, making the events accessible. And then something I was just running into, just talking to Lauren too, is again, we use everything. We go to the center of Clayton and it's not necessarily always accessible. I told Mark Smith about a time where my daughter got kicked out of the pool because somebody wasn't reading. I'm like, well, the rules on that, but also at the same time, like I'm trying to look up an event that's coming up and it's just not accessible. We have stuff on the websites in the city from 2023 is all I can find. So I would like also there to be, you know, maybe some more work on our websites so that it is accessible. And if we are accessible and it's not showing, we should be really sharing that. So those are the main areas that I would like to look like, is more on living here and making things accessible.
Is that accessible from an ADA standpoint or just accessible?
Well, then, so maybe some ADA stuff as well. I mean, basically, when you're looking at events, if anything's open to the public, it should be accessible. So if you're talking about sign language communication, we should have potentially interpreters at some of these events. As far as like accessibility, like on the community, I know that we've just redone our wheelchair ramps, which which are hilarious to me because they actually go right into the middle of the street. So if your wheelchair's not in control, you will literally roll right into the middle of the street and then you actually have to turn. I know that because I had to push a stroller around the city multiple times and it would push my stroller. I pushed my stroller right into the middle of the street because when we just redid those
I got
ramps.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know that we need, as far as the city, I know we just redid those ramps. I don't know about redoing those, but I think just making it more accessible. I've mentioned to previous people too, there are people in wheelchairs that live here that use the city who, you know, I could also get feedback and things like that. But I think just even starting to be accessible or just even start thinking about it. Typically when it's brought up, it's like, oh, that's going to cost money or it's going to be this, it's going to be too complicated. Some of the stuff really isn't that complicated.
I would just say that I think it's our intention to be fully accessible, certainly in compliance with ADA. And so to any extent that any one of us identifies issues with that, like I reported an issue on Saturday because I saw someone in a motorized scooter struggling on an area of sidewalk that was very uneven.
Yeah.
And so my expectation is that'll get fixed in a relatively timely manner because we try to keep the right of way accessible. Yeah, so I would definitely be interested. I believe that I believe that the board and the city intends to like prioritize and make that happen. So any specific examples would be great. And then if it turns out that we do need different system, like if it's just like it's an issue that hasn't been reported, so we didn't know to fix it and it gets fixed, that's great. If there's like a systemic issue where we're not following the latest best practice or something, then we would want to know that too, I think, and make sure it works.
We'll report those concerns. We allocate $120,000 every year for sidewalk and ADA improvements. So when we get things like that, we put them on the list and make sure that those are addressed. As far as the curb ramps in the city, anything that's been done, especially recently, I would say anytime in the last 25 years, they'll all meet ADA standards. If it's in the downtown area, because we receive federal money for those are actually designed to the federal standard and then reviewed at the federal level to make sure that they're compliant. So, but if people are still struggling with those, that's good for us to know. But we use the commonly accepted standards, and I realize people still struggle with some of those designs. So, yeah, make us aware of those things. Let us know where those things are. We try to do a good job of keeping track of that out in the field. But as I said, we put money towards it every year. We prioritize it on areas with the greatest need first. But if there are issues, we'd like to know what those issues are. And if this body wants to assess that or help with that assessment, that's great.
It's also increasingly common for, I've noticed, to have like ASL at events, right? To have sign language interpreters, making events more accessible. But I don't know if we've ever done that. I'm trying to remember if any of our like bigger events have ever had someone interpreting, but I would love to consider that. Like, what kind of things are we doing where that would be helpful and appropriate based on like that there is talking or whatever, right? Some kind of program that warrants that. I think that would be a great thing to do.
Well, I'm glad to hear there's interest in this because we have a potential speaker, thanks to Kathleen, who I'm hoping to be able to get in touch with that we could schedule for one of these upcoming meetings. We are booked for November with our judge. I believe we're booked for January with our state rep, Ian Mackey. But that leaves October and December and the spring. So I'm on it. Stuart.
So I didn't interrupt you. If you're
No, go
finishing.
for it.
Bring up another subject. Just want to ask where we are on that. We've tried to focus on affordable housing over the years, particularly with Chris. But I guess the issue is whether or not we're going to just basically put that to bed and say we've done as much as we can, or is there anything else we ought to be looking at with affordable housing or single-family zoning or anything in that area? I'm just throwing it out.
Yeah. I recently had a conversation with Dave and
David.
Becky, and there are some things possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I
that we
think
don't know about yet.
when I think about it, and I talked to Joanna about this once, because when we look at I'm very, it seems to me that across the country and certainly in St. Louis and Clayton, we actually just have a shortage of housing, which compounds issues with affordability and accessibility for people of all ages and family sizes and things like that. And so when we look at properties in Clayton, which is where we have influence in theory, we have what I would say are either like undeveloped or underdeveloped properties. The city doesn't own any of them, so we don't get to like actually drive what gets constructed there, but we can try to partner with the owners of those properties to try to maybe secure a project that would meet the goals that were outlined in Clayton Tomorrow 2040 in our comprehensive plan, to increase like variety of housing types available, somewhat maybe more affordable than what we have right now. And so I think You know, the ability to talk to folks at Wash U that might be interested in considering something like that for one or more properties in the community, or Centene. Those are the ideas that I have so far.
Is it correct to say that, Becky, that during this study for the planning ahead, that the idea of rezoning our single family to permit more housing on single family units was rejected, or am I wrong there?
So I would say we never had a proposal for rezoning. We did have a comprehensive plan draft version that suggested, I forget the language they used, David, but it was like generally saying like this area could be an area where it might seem appropriate to go from strictly single family to mixed, up to 2 or 4 family units.
I was thinking also,
And-
reading about some of these properties in other states and cities where the small unit is put right on the property of a single family, what would otherwise be single family residence.
Oh,
in
yeah,
the
you're
back.
talking about more like a additional outbuilding, right? Like a carriage house that you actually treat as a
Right,
separate
carriage
address or
houses,
domicile.
Small units and the like.
Yeah, yeah.
As I recall, the original draft of the comprehensive plan suggested actually 3 areas: Clayshire, Davis Place, and a portion of the Moorlands, all of which are essentially single family, and suggested that multifamily or duplexes be allowed in each one of those areas. I would say that was met with considerable opposition from the people who lived in all 3 of those areas. It was dropped from the draft, and that was kind of the end of that discussion. As I recall, there's still one of our topics this year for the board is still what I like to refer to as more affordable housing, as opposed to affordable, which has its own connotations. And
Yeah.
but so I
Thank
think
you.
that is still out there. I know
But-
there is a project that hasn't been submitted yet, an apartment project that I think is emphasizing, if it comes to pass and is approved, with smaller units than we have permitted in the past in apartments. And the applicant has indicated that project would have lower rents than any of our existing apartments. Now, that doesn't mean it will meet most people's test of affordable, but at least it is in moving in that direction. So I think this
Well,
is.
let me ask, Gary, can I interrupt? Should this be something that the CEC should make recommendations to the board in this whole area?
Stuart, and I'm
That's
sorry,
the
Ben,
question,
this,
whether we have a role or not with, you know, you know, I.
Can't hear you, Stuart.
Speak into your microphone
I'm
if you'd
sorry.
like to be heard.
Can you hear me, Ben? I'm sorry. You know, I did participate or, you know, I listened to the ARB meetings for about 8, 9 months and, you know, it got to a point where it was no point in me going. There was nothing that involved, I felt were equity issues. But, you know, the question is whether someone wants to take up the mantle from Chris to see if there's anything we can do as the Equity Commission with regard to providing more options, more housing options than we have in Clayton right now. I think, you know, Chris's goal of affordable housing may be unattainable, you know, but we are, you know, we're not like Aspen, you know, we're in a pretty much larger community where there are other options, but we do have a problem with land. We have very limited amount of land, so, you know, unless we can't go out, we can only go up. So
I have to get off now, unfortunately, but something I'd like to continue, have further discussion on this, in this area. So something that the CEC can take up.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
if I could just briefly talk about the priorities for Clayton Tomorrow 2040. I mean, we're going to get to this. It's a topic that's on the list. It was a topic that was identified in the plan. right now, what we're doing is we're working through the priorities that were established by the Board of Aldermen, and we've been making a lot of progress in those areas. So I think we'll get to it, but the initial focus on this is to fix the commercial zoning that we have, especially in the downtown area, to try to incentivize or at least get aligned with the market so that we can hopefully draw more businesses in as a part of that look, because we want to change the way we do plan unit developments, or at least discourage them. We are looking at unit sizes, so there's a little crossover right there for residential, because that's been an impediment in the past. So we're looking at commercial zoning. Lot coverage and stormwater is a huge priority for us, because we have issues related to stormwater, especially with rebuilds in some of our neighborhoods. So taking a look at those regulations. And then thirdly, we're working on neighborhood character, which was a top priority as well. So doing a full assessment of, what exactly is the character of each of these neighborhoods, and then seeing if we need to have any kind of specialized standards. So that's where we're at right now. So affordability is on the list. It just wasn't as high as some of these other things, out of the gate. So we're less than 12 months into the implementation portion of the plan. It's going to take years for us to work through the whole thing. And so we'll get there. But I can't imagine that we get there within the next, 6 to 9 months or so. But as soon as we do get there, I think there's certainly a role for CEC to play.
You're looking maybe in the spring or next summer?
Depends on how quickly we can get through these other items.
Can you
So,
just let us know.
but I think I think spring would be really quick. We'll see where we're at in the summer. When we're done with commercial zoning and stormwater, and we should be done certainly by that time, we'll establish what those next priorities are going to be. So this is something I'm sure will be part of that discussion.
Appreciate it.
I just want to add a little bit on that. I was part of some of the planning with that as well. For me too, so as a user, right? So as being in the community and using the community, one of the comments is always like, there's just luxury everything in Clayton, right? So there's luxury restaurants and luxury apartments. I mean, even if there was just regular, this one point, like even with kids and family, like even if there's just regular stuff, right? I think, looking at that, I don't think we need to go super low and so inexpensive, right? But, does everything really have to be luxury? That's where I think as families here, we don't always want to be fancy, and we're just not fancy all the time. And even just like going for a date night, sometimes we've been leaving the city because we're like, we've been to all these same restaurants, or we have to they're all fancy restaurants. So I would even be looking at, what's below even luxury, something else. I think that would be really appealing to people to not have so high end, maybe just like that other end.
All right, thank you. Anyone else have any other things they'd like to think about prioritizing in the next year?
I was just going to suggest that we invite Dr. Poole to come and update us on, again, it's not up to us what the school district does, but I think we've obviously expressed interest in what it does and made some suggestions, and at least I'd like to hear from Dr. Poole what's going on. So
I think, the school year started and we can let them get off and running, and then I know he's invited every time anyway, but I'll touch base with him too. Can you pull the agenda up again?
Well, I would just remind people too that as residents and taxpayers to the school district, you can speak to your school board members. So I would encourage you to do that when you have something, or go to a school board meeting and give public comment, right? We sometimes get to talk to them and they might have a very mild interest in what we say as like a totally separate governing body or political neighborhood. But I can just say, as an elected official here on our board, like if residents actually take the time to reach out or come to a meeting and talk, I know it makes an impact on us, and I would hope it does on them too, so.
And I know we were supposed to have somebody from the youth advisory board who was supposed to be coming. Unfortunately, I heard that our meeting time doesn't work with anyone on the youth advisory board. So we're not going to have anybody from the high school for this year. Yeah. So that's unfortunate,
Huh.
but that happens. All right. Any public comments? Any comments from members?
I'm not a member, but I'll comment on something very quickly. So Andrea Muskoff, as you know, who is the assistant city manager, took the job as city administrator in Frontenac. And so She's doing a great job over there, but we posted the assistant city manager position. We made a hire, so we posted or made an announcement as far as who we're hiring. His name is Myron Burr Jr., and he's coming to us from the chancellor's office at UMSL at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. He used to run their DEI office when they had one. That was dismantled here within the last 12 months or so. But he does work in strategic initiatives there. He does a ton of strategic planning for the university, not just in equity type areas, but just broadly. So he's a policy specialist. He's nearly done with his MPA or his public administration degree, master's degree. He has a master's degree in higher education already, and then a bachelor's in communications. So it fits really, really well with what we're doing here in Clayton. I will, just like with Andrea, assign CEC to him, where he's going to be the primary liaison that you'll have on staff. But I do think he's going to be a huge asset for not just the city, but CEC in particular. So really look forward to that. He starts with the city on September 29th, so he'll be here for the meeting in October. And I'm excited to introduce him to everybody, and I think you're really going to like him. So I just wanted to make sure you all knew that was coming, and hopefully you saw the post that we put out within the last week or so. Really excited to get him here.
That sounds great. Thanks, Dave. Well, our next meeting is October the 9th. I will see you all here. Is there a motion to adjourn? Second?
I'll second it.
All in favor? Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Um,
Thanks. Have
Hope
a
to
great
see
night.
you in person next month.